Well, it's Sunday afternoon, Easter Sunday, and I had just heard with some trepidation my effort of yesterday played back up to the year 1935, and therefore I will endeavour to continue from that point. I left off in the conclusion of the Italian invasion of Abyssinia, leaving quite useless League of Nations hopelessly unable to make any impression on what was going on. And the rest of Europe, Germany excepted of course, merely expressing horror and disgust, but a clear indication of the way that a fascist world was going to move. Such, of course, then was Europe in 1935. I should have mentioned, hardly mentioned, the Middle East at all. And I don't propose to attempt much in that direction since I don't tend to understand the Middle East. But it is worth recording that at that time, Iran, or Persia as then called, had a very pro-Western government under the Shah, who was displaced later in 1979 amid much trouble. That it is fair to say a very shambolic series of small states in the Middle East were controlled up to a point by Britain and France, were a constant source of problems. These problems, of course, being aggravated by attempts from the north, i.e. Russia, to interfere where it thought he could get away with it. However, 1935 once more, and I will perhaps start by referring to our family situation at that time. I was 12 years old and just beginning to know something of what was going on in the world around me. The rest of my brothers and sisters, of course, were much too young. I was aware that my father was struggling business-wise, but managing to keep his head above water. And in fact, from then on, until the outbreak of war, Simon Duncan were proceeding reasonably well as anyway one could have hoped for in those difficult times. Of the other members of the family, Auntie Doris, as I think you know, was by that time a senior teacher and I think already deputy headmistress at her school in Chertsey, and was, of course, due to carry the school through the very difficult years of the war. She had, at that time, a close American friend who had come over on a school exchange, and in 36, I think, Auntie was invited back to stay with that friend in America, which she did on what I believe was the second voyage of the Queen Mary. A remarkable privilege. Because the Queen Mary, of course, was, in fact, I believe still is the largest passenger liner of its type at any rate. Certainly, at that time, the largest ship built for the transmission of passengers ever created. Even larger than her sister ship, the Queen Elizabeth, which was launched a couple of years later. These two, of course, were all important in the war years. Other parts of our family, my father's father, Grandad Duncan, was very firmly coming up to retirement. He made it clear he wasn't going to carry on any longer. He was, of course, a widower with a housekeeper, whom he subsequently married. And Grandad Kent was, of course, part of our family in Blakeney Road. Talking of Kent, I should perhaps have mentioned a curious feature of my birth took place in 1923, and I was actually born in the Kent House, which was very temporarily a nursing home created at the end of the First World War out of a very, very ancient public house called the Kent House, which had stood in that position on the borders between London and Kent for several centuries. And, of course, ironically, I was the eldest son of a lady who had been Dorothy Kent before her marriage. So you might reasonably say that the argument between who was a man of Kent and a Kentish man didn't apply to me. I was indeed both. Reverting then to 1935-36. The year 1936, with all the perils faced ahead, was started with the sad death of King George V, to whom, in retrospect, we now realise we owe rather a lot. His very ordinary common sense had made a great deal of difference to the manner in which Britain faced the economic collapses following the Wall Street crash. So that by 1935, 36, we were doing about as well as any of the European states. Probably better than anybody outside perhaps Scandinavia. So George V's death was, of course, received with much sadness. We had, of course, had his 25th anniversary in the previous year, and great celebrations took place in the King's Silver Jubilee in 1935. And it was, I think, a demonstration then of how much the country had quietly appreciated all he had achieved. I know that we had in Beckenham a tremendous celebratory procession in which Simon Duncan's lorry appeared with my two younger brothers seated on benches dressed up as painters with berries on their heads. And there is still a photograph to be found somewhere amongst my papers of the celebration. We then, of course, found that we had a new king, Edward VIII, and I don't propose to spend too much time elaborating the details of his disastrous year on the throne, which, as everybody knows, ended in his abdicating following his entanglement with an American lady twice divorced, Mrs. Wallis Simpson, whom I should say was often referred to in the years during and just after the war as a lady for whom we should be deeply grateful, as she was, in effect, the one who saw to it, quite unintentionally of course, that we didn't have the wrong man on the throne during the perilous years of the war. Edward VIII was quite definitely pro-Nazi, if not actually pro-German. He was very right-wing in his attitude, or with a mix of right and extreme left-wing views, which he never balanced properly, and his approach to his royal position was altogether wrong. After his abdication, as is generally known, he actually, with his new wife, visited Germany and was entertained by Hitler. And there were even suggestions that he might have been hoping in 1940 that a peace with Hitler would incorporate a return to the monarchy of Edward VIII as an ally of German hegemony. It's very uncertain that one shall not pursue that one too far. But let us be satisfied with the clear statement that we were very well rid of Edward VIII, and therefore have some reason to be grateful to the unfortunate and unsatisfactory Mrs. Simpson. The year 1936 may have been an awkward one in Britain. It undoubtedly was, but it was a great deal more awkward elsewhere, because by this time her Hitler had clearly shown his hand, and it was very obvious that Nazi Germany has no intention of quietly reinstating Germany as a simple European state. He had every intention of a master race taking over, at any rate, the major part of Europe. Whether his ambition even included France as well, we'll never know. But it seems that the Nazism envisaged the complete control of Europe as we know it, and in defiance of Soviet Russia, with whom they obviously foresaw an ultimate showdown. And of course eventually happened. Anyway, 1936 continued on very shaky grounds. Early on in that year, the Germans reoccupied the Rhineland, which was in flagrant disobedience of the Treaty of Versailles after the First World War. It was had been agreed that the Rhineland would never be militarized again, and it would remain a sort of buffer unit between Germany and France. And in the same year, Germany was already showing signs of aggression towards her neighbours, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and even Austria, although here it wasn't a matter of aggression, there's tension to take over, because there was a big fascist element in Austria already. So it is fair to say that the year 1936 was one not of actual disasters as impending doom. Our very good headmaster that we had at school took to giving a weekly gathering of all the sixth form boys, in which he did his best to put a reasonably impartial picture of the present state of the world to those he thought were old enough to begin to understand it. He obviously foresaw that the very boys he was addressing were the ones who were going to have to fight in the coming war, and therefore deserved to be given a little warning of it. And he was very sound. 1937 left us with a brand new monarch, George VI, who was, by his own account, hopelessly unprepared for monarchy and who had never any wish to take the crown, but felt he had no choice. And although he was certainly unsuited to many features of kingship, he proved in a very satisfactory monarch, operating as far from the background as he possibly could, but of course superbly supported by Queen Elizabeth, the mother of our present Queen, of course, who guided her husband through the war and beyond, and to whom really this country must be very grateful. Their coronation took place in 1937. I have to admit that I went off and played cricket that day. Coronations were not for me, but it was a great occasion, and the last great occasion before the war. By that time, the behaviour of the Germans was becoming more and more threatening. The Danish Civil War was at its worst, and the Italians, having swallowed up, so they thought, Abyssinia, were making great show of being part of the oncoming fascist rule of Europe. I don't think even Hitler had very much faith in their assistance, but they were allowed to tag along. The French, as always, were politically totally unstable and not able to make up their mind whether to try to stand up to Hitler or not. And it all pointed to the political collapse of France, which took place 2 years later. In the year 1938, things were looking politically threatening, although not a great deal had happened physically. But in the early part of that year, Hitler made quite openly clear his intentions of taking over Czechoslovakia. Now, Czechoslovakia was in any case a problem area because it consisted mainly of land taken from the Germans at the Treaty of Versailles, also from the Austrians, but it was an unsatisfactory mixture of peoples, Bohemian being the principal race, if you could so call it. But it was always contained large numbers of, one might say, displaced Germans on the northern side, and even Austrians and Poles, I suppose, on the eastern side. So Hitler made no bones about the fact that in his eyes, the whole of that little state should belong to Germany. And much of the early middle part of 1938 was taken up in quite fruitless attempts by the remainder of France and Britain mainly, with inadequate support from the useless League of Nations and almost no support at all from the Americans, who, just words of the old expression, didn't want to know. However, by the early autumn of 1938, you might say that the chips were down, and Germany had announced that she was about to march into Czechoslovakia. Our commitments being what they were, it would have been, shall we say, demeaning for us not to try to do something about it. It was very clear that the French were not going to support us in any big way. And it is fair to say, I think, that our new Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, who had taken over from Stanley Baldwin the year before, although he nowadays subjected to much criticism for his, in a way, appeasing Hitler, as the people like to say, he was in an impossible position. It now has long since been revealed that the military commands in Britain and the naval command in Britain, say nothing of the Air Force, had all made it very clear to the Prime Minister that we were in no position to go to war in 1938. And the only long-term sensible thing that a prime minister could do was play for time. And, perhaps in a rather humiliating fashion, much to the indignation of a good many people in Parliament, and above all Winston Churchill, and Chamberlain made separate visits to Germany to try and iron out some sort of compromise arrangement, culminating in his final journey to Munich in the October, where, somewhat I think to most people's surprise, Hitler decided it would pay him to relent to the extent of agreeing to limited takeover of the undoubtedly German-speaking parts of Czechoslovakia, but at the same time giving an undertaking to go no further, which undertaking I need hardly say he had no intention of keeping. So, Chamberlain returned from Munich in October, or possibly early November 1938, with what was described as a piece of paper, i.e. a written agreement by the Germans that their advances on Sudetenland, which was the German-speaking bit of Czechoslovakia, were the limit of their ambition. They were not going to send it any further and would support the independence of the remainder of Czechoslovakia. So the unfortunate Czechs, who had, I suppose, quite unwisely indicated they were going to try to resist, which would have been impossible, had to give way and allow the Germans to take over the bits that they wanted, in other words. And this was the situation in late 1938. Chamberlain, with the very shaky and insincere support of the French, had achieved a so-called peace settlement with Germany, which Germany had no intention of adhering to, but which at the time, I think it is fair to say that a lot of people genuinely believed was, as Chamberlain liked to call it, peace in our time. Well, our time didn't last very long, because came the year 1939, and after an uneventful winter, the Germans simply walked into the rest of Czechoslovakia, without even a moment's warning. And frankly, there wasn't very much we or anyone else could do about it. Certainly the Americans were not going to get involved, and the French were completely unable to do anything. And as I've already said, Chamberlain had already been warned by the chiefs of his three services that Britain was in no state whatsoever to declare war on anybody. So, after the obviously much outspoken comment, indignation, the year 1939 proceeded almost immediately after the takeover of Czechoslovakia with an outspoken threat to Poland from the Germans, who more or less indicated that they were going to take over Poland willy-nilly, whatever anybody said. Although they didn't put it quite so bluntly, but it made it quite clear that there were large parts of Poland which they considered were German, which in fact they were by race and language. At this point, I think, probably May 1939, Chamberlain went so far as to say that an invasion of Poland would mean that Britain and Germany would be at war, and the French, reluctantly, I have no doubt, gave nominal support. So that we were, by the summer of 1939, facing war if and when the Germans decided they were going to attack Poland, or for that matter, anywhere else, particularly Belgium. The summer of 1939 was, apart from aggressive speeches in all directions, fairly uneventful, but it was no surprise to anyone when the Germans attacked Poland in the last days of August. And straight away, Chamberlain indicated to the Germans that if they did not cease that action at once, Britain would be at war with Germany, which in fact we were only by September the 3rd. And somewhat surprisingly, I think, the French followed suit. So we then had a state of war in the autumn of 1939, I think, which in a way has surprised everybody. We don't think that the Germans really thought that Britain was going to go so far as to declare war, or that the French would do likewise. And I think he thought that having come to a very false military agreement with Russia at the end of the summer, which was pretty meaningless, but meant that Russia was at any rate not going to interfere with his attack on Poland, he was safe to go ahead, which he did. So, by the latter part of 1939, we were in a state of war, but since nobody quite knew what was going to happen after the inevitable collapse of Poland, and the Germans sorted themselves out and took over what they considered was their new territory, where one went from there. It was perfectly obvious to everyone that if the Germans genuinely considered that they were going to be opposed and that the war was a genuine war, then they were indeed going to attack France through Belgium. But of course, there was no clear indication. The French had built what was called the Maginot Line as a defensive line against German advance, which only, of course, covered the boundaries between Germany and France and didn't cover an entry via Belgium. So the French were particularly vulnerable. We then had, I suppose, what might be described as 6 to 8 months of what is known as the phony war. In other words, a war without anything much going on. There was quite a bit going on at sea. We lost a battleship right at the beginning of the war, sunk in Scarborough Flow by a German submarine. But much more importantly, there was a naval battle in the South Atlantic at which the German pocket battleship, the Graf Spee, was severely damaged by 3 comparatively small British ships. I think they were called the Exeter, Ajax, and Achilles. One of them was a small cruiser and the other 2 were destroyers, if I remember rightly. But the battleship was severely damaged and put into Montevideo, the capital of Uruguay, to escape further damage and presumably sinking. The British ships remained more or less on the horizon, pretending that there were vast quantities of supporting ships in the British Navy all coming to assist them if the Graf Spee dared to come out and fight it out. And after some lot of political shenanigans, the Uruguayans insisted that the Germans remove their battleship so that the Graf Spee came out of harbour. And then, with the expectation that it was going to be overwhelmed by British naval ships, the German captain, wishing to save his crew, which was not unreasonable, sent them ashore in little boats and scuttled the ship in deep water and himself committed suicide. Of course, later transpired that the Exeter, Ajax, and Achilles, themselves somewhat damaged by the earlier encounters, would not have been capable of sinking the Graf Spee, and there weren't any British naval ships just over the horizon to come and finish her off. So that was a bit of successful British naval bluff, which one gathers annoyed Adolf Hitler rather considerably. But that was our sole success for the early part of the war. Well, it was a quiet winter, I think very much the phony war, and nothing happened until the early spring, when Hitler sprung a surprise on everybody, and I think this one did take everyone or appears to have taken everyone by surprise, when they suddenly attacked the totally neutral Norway. We now realize why Hitler wanted Norway. He didn't want to interfere with Sweden with a useful neutral. But as one later realized, what Hitler wanted was Norwegian ports and fjords and what have you for bases for submarine activities against the British Navy and British Merchant Navy to assist the blockading of Britain and preventing supplies arriving from the Americas. And for this purpose, Norway was ideally positioned. We now realize how important Norway later became as well, from the German point of view, because they were able to attack in 1943-44 the British supply convoys taking supplies to Murmansk to assist the Russians. But I don't think that Hitler was clever enough to have foreseen that one. From his point of view, Norway, I think, was a very fortunate acquisition, but a very awkward one for Britain because we were caught unawares and didn't put up a very good job of defending the Norwegians. The Germans had pretty well taken over the country before we had any chance of moving. This, however, might in the long term have proved a good thing because it brought to a head dissatisfaction with the Chamberlain government. The Houses of Parliament put all the blame for the whole possible situation by May 1940. Poor Chamberlain, who is said to have done his inadequate best, he was placed in a position where he had no alternative but to resign. Probably just as well because the poor chap was already suffering from cancer and died only a few months later. But he's always, I think, been very unfairly criticised for his actions in 38 and 39. At least he effectively gave Britain nearly 2 more years in which to prepare for the Battle of Britain. And those years might have made all the difference. However, we were back to the May of 1940, and somewhat reluctantly, one feels, that the House of Commons elected a new leader, Winston Churchill. I think a lot of people, a lot of staunch conservatives, were very uncertain about him, and certainly he hadn't been a particular success as First Lord of the Admiralty. Some of the blame for the shortcomings of the Norwegian campaign might have been put upon him. But there really was no doubt that there was nobody else capable of leading real resistance to Germany at a political level because he was at least in a position to say, well, for years I have been warning this country of the perils of Nazi Germany, and I have been insisting that we prepared, and only in the very late years had he been listened to. Well, we had perhaps just about prepared enough for resistance to the invasion of this country by that time. In almost as Churchill was being elected, or perhaps a few days previously, I think, Hitler or the Germans invaded not only Belgium but also Holland, who had, I think, expected to be able to stay out, and invaded the Low Countries, in other words, with a determined attack upon France. And I think there's no doubt that their German expectation is that they would force their way through the French army and seize Paris before there was any reasonable attempt by the British to land support in the Low Countries to put up much resistance. And this more or less is what happened. In fact, initially, the French managed some reasonable resistance, long enough for an already prepared British expeditionary force to land in Belgium, and in fact score 1 or 2 successes against the advancing Germans, who were overreaching themselves a little. And by round about the 20th of May, it was touch and go as to whether the Germans would in fact break the French lines, push back limited British expeditionary force, and continue through. But by about that date, it was obvious that they were going to. The British were not nearly numerous enough to provide any long-term resistance. One portion of the French army was separated from the main body by a German central thrust, so that we had a situation of the French rapidly retreating to defensive lines to protect Paris and northern France. The British completely pushed back by much greater German forces, I think, than we had expected to find in Belgium so early on, and a rather disoriented breakaway unit of the French army, which had come disconnected from the main body and was trapped somewhere between Calais and Dunkirk by the advancing Germans. So by about the 25th of May, we were in a situation whereby the British Expeditionary Force was apparently trapped on the beaches in and around Dunkirk, or just beyond them, with little or no possibility of rescue. And the order went out about the 25th of May for the complete evacuation of the British Expeditionary Force. And this was led, of course, by the Navy under Admiral Ramsay, who much of the credit for the Dunkirk evacuation must go. but with much support, of course, from the Air Force, and, of course, as is historically recorded, incessantly recorded by the armada of small boats and small ships. They're making their own way across the short distance of the channel to extricate the soldiers from the beaches of Dunkirk. Early on in the evacuation period, 25th, 26th, 27th of May, even Churchill, I think, thought we could never hope to extricate more than 20 or 30,000 of the British expeditionary force. And it remains a minor miracle that by the 5th or 6th of June, we had managed to extricate somewhere around about 335,000. A figure which would have been considered total lunacy a fortnight beforehand. It was a combination of incredible efforts by the Navy and by the sporting little ships, and by a degree of incompetence by the Germans, who somehow I couldn't believe that they had so completely overwhelmed the expeditionary force that they allowed themselves to be held back from the Dunkirk beaches by a comparatively small last-minute defence force. I think much of the credit must go to Alan Brooke, who was, I think, the corps commander of that particular area. Lord Galt, the commander-in-chief of the expeditionary force, had already been ordered back to England by the British. I think they primarily didn't want what might be described as the tactical disgrace of even the commander-in-chief being captured. But in fact, even Alan Brooke and Montgomery, I think, who was junior under him, got away at the last minute. Together, incredibly enough, with over 100,000 of the French forces cut off, so that the 330-odd thousand rescued, only about two-thirds were British and the other third French, more or less all of whom were, of course, returned to France, no doubt via the Channel ports, with the idea of their supporting the further resistance to the oncoming Germans and around Paris. Of course, by that time, the Germans had broken too far, and France was in a state of collapse. Churchill flew over to France not once, I think, but 3 times in attempts to rescue the situation or put some life into the French army, which was disintegrating anyway. And large parts of it under Pétain were apparently only too pleased to give way to the Germans and attain a humiliating but reasonable peace settlement from their point of view. Such, therefore, was the situation by mid-June 1940. Britain and what you might call the Empire, but they were rather a long way off. We were on our own, very much on our own, against a very victorious and aggressive Germany. Austria had already been absorbed by Germany the year before without any military effort. So once the peace with France was settled, the northern part of France being German-controlled settlement, and the southern part of what they called Vichy France being nominally independent, but very much under German domination. The Italians had come into the war just to be on the right side, of course, sometime in May or June 1940, and they had declared war on Britain and France off their own bat and made a great show of being part of the victorious fascist combination. Fortunately I think probably for everybody, the Spanish Civil War had more or less come to an end, and such was a state of chaos in Spain that they were not going to get involved, and they possibly, Franco, that is their leader, was not going to get involved in anything, or not in a position to get involved in the war. And the Germans realized that to involve Spain would merely involve useless use of their troops. So they simply ignored the Spanish altogether, and simply regarded them as an ally, which really took no part in anything other than political movements. The rest of Europe, right up to the Russian border, was German. The Russians had, in fact, taken advantage of the situation in the West to seize back some of the Baltic countries, I think, and bits of Poland, I believe, and just remain nominally as a German ally, just taking off what bits of Europe they found it convenient to do and hold their fire on the great developments. They invaded Finland and took bits of that, but that wasn't a terribly important development, and it may have annoyed the Germans just as much as it did us. The Middle East was, for the time being, more or less under British control, if only because the Germans didn't have any troops in that area, and the Russians were not interested in interfering, so that Palestine and Syria, Iraq, Egypt, or what have you, was left nominally independent and actually more or less controlled in a loose sort of fashion by British troops. Which sets us in the position, as I've already just said, of being on our own, wondering where we went from there. This was mid-June 40. It was obvious that the Germans were wanting to invade Britain if they could, knock us out of the war, leave us in much the same state probably as they had left France politically, and seize whatever they wanted to of the British Empire. But I think there was a realization in Germany that if that was going to happen, they were in fact going to have to invade in a proper way. And that wasn't all that easy. The powers of the British Navy and even a bit of support from the Air Force had already indicated to the Germans that that wasn't a policy that could be followed through with the utmost ease. And there was a definite attempt by the Germans in late June to bolster a genuine compromise peace with Britain and the Empire. They would never have lasted, of course. The Germans would have still have had their eyes on us for the future. But I think the Germans were more concerned about being ready to tackle Russia than they were concerned about controlling Britain, which they regarded as a plum that could be taken off the tree whenever they really felt like it. But negotiations, and there were negotiations in secret with the Churchill government for a peace, which the Germans, I no doubt expected, would give them no trouble at all, ran into difficulties because Churchill wasn't having any. And we then got the speeches of defiance by Churchill, eventually winning over the House of Parliament that we were not going to give in and we're going to have to fight it out. I won't bother to quote all the great Churchillian speeches of the time, but it somehow, it is fair to say, although shall we say, it's nice to be able to say it, to quote Churchill, that if the British Empire was to last 1,000 years, this was their brightest hour. Somehow or other, Churchill managed to carry the day, and everybody said, yes, we're behind you, and come on, do your best, do your worst to the Germans. So we had a curious period of, I suppose, about 6 weeks, I'm not sure, with no great activity anywhere, except presumably at sea. And then the first of the German air attacks on Britain, on the British airfields, of course, since they knew full well that there was no invasion of Britain while we had an effective air force to back up the Navy. I don't need to give you the history of the Battle of Britain. You probably know it better than I do. I was having just left school at the end of July. I was part of the harvest camp. All the children were down everywhere in the country. The schools were helping to carrying in the harvest before the winter. And I was in a harvest camp in Kent, near Sevenoaks, Amesford, and from which position I was able to sit back in the trees that I was picking and watch much of the Battle of Britain taking place overhead. The leaves of the trees got very much in the way, so I missed quite a lot of it, but it's remarkable how much I did see. And, of course, as we all know now, the Battle of Britain proved just one too many battles for the Germans, and they lost by a very narrow margin. Partly, in my opinion, of course, and I know I'm biased, our possession of radar giving us the ability to observe oncoming German waves of aircraft at a distance and be ready for them made all the difference. And one other interesting point, which is obvious when you think about it, was the fact that with all the fighting taking part in the air over England, we had the advantage that when a British aircraft was shot down, as so many were, very often the pilot was able to bail out and be available to go back to his unit and take another aircraft out the next day. Whereas when the German was shot down, he landed in Britain and was taken prisoner. So that there was a steady decline in the numbers of top-class German pilots available. A much greater decline than there was of British pilots, which more than made up in the end for the initial numerical advantages that the Germans had. So by mid-September, September the 15th, I think, is often regarded as the crucial final date of the Battle of Britain, although it wasn't anything like so precise as that. But by mid-September, the Germans had shot their bolt as far as the Battle of Britain proper was concerned, and they then turned very quickly first to direct bombing raids on the London docks and around, and then night bombing, which Hitler felt would, after a month or two, drive the British into agreeing to a peaceful settlement, which he wasn't going to achieve otherwise. So we are back in the autumn of 1940 with our family, largely in the air raid shelter at the bottom of the garden, the tennis courts dug up and Grandad Kent digging for victory for 6 years, or very nearly, and keeping the family alive on at least on vegetables. The like, and a very large chicken run over and above the air raid shelter, kept for 6 years by my brother Peter, who I expect by 1946 never wanted to see another chicken. And certainly by late September, early October 1940, we were growing very tired of perfectly secure and satisfactory concrete and steel, very crude air raid shelter in the bottom of the garden. And Grandpa had the brilliant idea of digging under the billiard room and forming what was virtually an indoor, underfloor air raid shelter, which he designed very cleverly, held and slept 8 people during much of the ensuing 5 years. With the billiard table remaining where it was, as I've told you before, acting as a protection to the trapdoor which led down into the air raid shelter. And we had another emergency exit at the other end that took us straight outside in case of emergencies. And such was the Duncan family through the very miserable autumn and early winter of 1940.